Okay, well, offline, I was telling you about a podcast episode from the Daily Podcast. This was released in January. I've literally had to listen to this conversation 5 times now. I listened to it again today. And every time I listen to this conversation, and the title of the podcast episode was an aggressive new approach to childhood obesity or something like that. And they were talking about how obesity in children is becoming a huge problem. It wasn't much of a problem in the 60s, but in the 70s it got worse. In the 80s, it really got worse. She mentioned different studies they did where they took entire like it sounded like school districts and did randomized controlled trials where they would go into one school district and teach the kids everything they needed to know about obesity. So they taught them how to move and why to work out, and provided more access to fruits and vegetables. And they noticed that no matter how much they coached this school, the results were exactly the same. And so everything they thought they knew was not working for childhood obesity. So the conclusion that they have come to is that childhood obesity is genetic. Literally saying there's nothing you can do about this. It's a serious problem. You're going to have it. And once you get it, you're not going to be able to reverse it. So again, the American Pediatrics Association or whoever is recommending that at the age of 2, you can start to prescribe really heavy nutritional counseling for a 2-year-old and also for the whole family, and make sure that they understand what exercise does and why they need to do that. It's very expensive, requires lots of different experts in different fields to be able to coach. At age 12, if they're still presenting with obesity, it's recommended to give kids GLP-1 agonists, I believe they're called, like Ozempic is the big one that's really popular. And at 13, if they're still expressing obesity, we can now do bariatric surgery on these kiddos. What do you think of all that?
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a lot there. So there are certain aspects of that I would have to agree with, right? Like, I think that what we're seeing in kids is part genotype or genetics, part phenotype, right? The physiology that's interacting with the environment or the nutrition side of things. Like, so it's the genotype and phenotype interacting with the environment to result in one, if not multiple, chronic conditions in these kids. I don't think the solutions are simple or easy, but I do think, like, I don't know. So from our research, I can speak from what I know from our research in kids is that I think manipulating diet alone in a way that's, not too restrictive, can have profound impact on metabolic health in kids. And we can see, like in our studies, we see reversal of metabolic disease with using with diet within our studies and family-based interventions. I have to say, like, for some kids, it's, I'm not going to sit here and say that, like, for everyone that's going to work, because we do see in our studies, like, varied responses. Like, some respond really well to the diet interventions that we use and we have the families on. Others don't respond as well. So I think it's like, at the end of the day, sometimes, like, we just have to weigh the costs and the benefits of doing these different types of interventions. So, like, for instance, this sort of speaks to, like, a precision nutrition approach, right? That based on your metabolic phenotype, based on genotype, metabolic phenotype, it determines how you're going to respond to specific types of diets, right? When we randomize kids to whether it's like a low carb or a low fat diet, we see varied response. If we look at the averages, on average, what we see is with our carbohydrate restricted diets that our kids with fatty liver respond really well to that diet on average. But within that group, if you look at the individual responses, not all of them do. So, what we don't know is if we put them on some other type of diet, would they be responding better? At the end of the day, like, I think, using a family-based approach for adolescents is very effective and necessary to get all of, like, the entire family on board to help change the behavior. But at the end of the day, I do think it's like a genetic, genotype and phenotype interaction with the food environment that's sort of driving some of these things. And I think that, like, there are some dietary changes that can be made that could help some people avoid having to take medication the rest of their lives, and also help them from, prevent them from having to have bariatric surgery and things like that. So I don't know if that kind of like answers your question, but
No, it really does. Part of what makes us human is to be able to leverage different technologies, and we're learning all the time and coming up with new compounds. We're coming up with new surgeries, and they can help for sure. And
mhm,
one of the points that this podcast made is like when you decide to do bariatric surgery, you can't really go back. Like this is a very permanent thing that you're then going to live with for your entire life. So, we even just mentioned in your introduction, you are trying to find non invasive ways of changing this through diet. Is that going to work 100% of the time? Maybe not. Maybe compliance is going to be very difficult. Maybe money is going to be a factor. Maybe, sugary foods taste really good. Sweet foods and processed foods are delicious, and they're very cheap, and they're easy to find. They're at the hardware store, for example, like they're everywhere. So is it going to work every time? But like, no, but why are we not at least starting with that? And then down the road, if we still have issues, look at all these amazing other technologies that we can try.
right. Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. And not like all of these things, they're not without long-term consequences, like you said. Like for the new generation of obesity medications that are on the market now, there's so much we don't know still about the long-term efficacy of them. Are there going to be some sort of unintended consequences? That's a very real, question that a lot of investigators still have. um, fully acknowledging that maybe there aren't, maybe it's going to be perfectly fine, and that truly is as good as we think it is. It's, designed to be. So, but like you said, like bariatric surgery has its, benefits, but it also has some long-term consequences, or, long-term maintenance things that have to be considered before, fundamentally changing your GI tract and the way in which you metabolize food, and what type of diet you have to be on for the rest of your life, regardless of whether you have surgery or not. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm hopeful, just because from what we've done and what we've seen in our trials, that diet alone can be a really effective tool to help kids and families help set kids up for long-term success, and avoid going down the path of developing other related chronic metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. That would be a perfect segue. I was wondering if you could define for us the difference between a chronic metabolic disease and something more like an acute disease that would send me to the hospital. What are the differences there? How do each of those work a little bit differently?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about like a chronic metabolic disease, it's really, we list off things that essentially it's a disease that's um, sort of like, well, we call it metabolic because it affects your metabolism. It affects the way in which you metabolize nutrients. For instance, a lot of them originate from insulin resistance. So it's like a long-term condition that you can't really like take a drug and in the short term fix it. It's something you can take a drug long term to help manage the symptoms. But the drugs don't necessarily treat the underlying issue when it comes to like chronic metabolic disease, which would be compared to like some other acute illness that perhaps you go to the doctor and they'll prescribe you a medication, you're on a short course of antibiotics or something like that, and your disease gets reversed, or you can become well. A chronic disease is something it's typically, related to lifestyle in some way, like related to nutrition. You end up with an underlying sort of underlying issue related to the metabolism of nutrients, and that in turn can develop into a specific disease state. I hope I described that in like a way that was understandable, but